hit record. And so we're recording. So Christian, why don't you tell them a little bit about yourself, and then you can just launch into your lecture. You didn't use share screen, did you?
I'm sorry?
Are you just going to talk, or did you have visuals?
I don't have visual, actually, only of you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, if you don't need to use visuals, then that's fine. You don't need the share screen feature then. But yeah, go ahead and tell them a little bit about yourself. I'm going to be behind the scenes. You're just going to see this, but I'm here. So if you need me for anything, just say my name and I will pop back up.
And just to be clear, so I hit participants if I want to see people?
No, you won't be able to see anyone else. It's just the feature of the
I
webinar
see.
function, unfortunately.
Okay.
But they will be able to ask questions, and we will get to them at the end. At the end, all of those questions, they'll be lighting up that little box, and I will read them out loud to you at the end, and you can follow along if you like and answer questions then. So
Okay.
they're all there, and they're all watching and listening. So don't worry about that. So if
Excellent.
whenever you're done, I will go through those questions with you. Okay, guys. So I'm gonna take a step back so Christian can tell you about himself and get right to the lecture.
Hi there. I'm Christian Taylor. I'm founder of Taylor Lane Productions. I've been in the entertainment business for about 10 years. I started out in literary management at Industry Entertainment and worked in development at Imagine Entertainment before I found my own company, Taylor Lane Productions, in 2011. Joey asked me what we should cover today, and I think I get this question a lot. Why isn't my screenplay working in the current marketplace? Why aren't I getting enough attention? You know, I have 2 or 3 specs that I want to send out. Which one should I send? These are questions I get a lot. And so I thought it would be really helpful to talk about that a little bit today, and talk about the current trends that are happening in the marketplace right now, and how to make your particular screenplay really resonate in the current marketplace, especially if you're writing something that is in a particularly crowded or overused genre. We can talk about that a little bit too. So I thought we'd start with current market trends and what's happening in the business right now. We're in a precarious place. There's a lot of television going on at the moment, which we call peak TV on Netflix and Amazon. I think the market actually is getting a bit oversaturated at the moment. There are just too many outlets, too many shows, not a big enough audience. So we're starting to see some of those shows cutting back a bit on some of those things. So I think we should we'll talk about a little bit more about that today. But I'm gonna start with some of the trends that are happening right now, just in terms of film. Right now we're seeing a lot of diverse casting, stories with Latin American protagonists, African American protagonists, Asia, China. You know, we're really embracing the politically correct climate that's happening right now today. And I'm not talking about stories necessarily period dramas and things like that, but very contemporary, diverse stories, I think are very big right now, which is a really great thing. So that's something we'll talk a little bit more about later on. Female-driven stories are big now. Action thrillers, I'm sure you've seen some of those lately. Female-driven action comedies. There was a Marion Speckzale a few weeks ago that went to Sony with Margot Robbie attached. You know, Wonder Woman, and of course, you see this happening all the time now. I think it's a great time to write a female-driven drama, thriller. Any of these are pretty big right now in the marketplace. Another thing I want to talk about today are mid-budget films, and those are usually features between $10 and $50 million. They're kind of the movies that studios used to make, that Netflix and Amazon are kind of starting to make more right now. Those are big, especially with independent producers and production companies. A lot of people are looking for, you know, prestige dramas with A-level casts, international thrillers, R-rated comedies, sci-fi that can be done on a reasonable budget, like Ex Machina and things like that. Inspiring, faith-driven stories are really big right now. That's, to me, a very big hole in the marketplace because, you know, the studios are really just making tentpole movies now, and the occasional kind of prestige drama that comes out around award season. So I think there's a tremendous need in the marketplace for films that are in the 10 to 50 million independent space. And we can talk about that a bit more when we get to the question and answer period. So in terms of some of the streaming services, Netflix and Amazon are generally looking at these mid-range movies quite a bit right now. Anything from $10 to $50 million. Netflix tends to be making movies that are more star-driven, big budget comedies, more political thrillers, broad comedies, and more commercial kind of more commercial stories at the moment, whereas Amazon seems to be concentrating more on prestige kind of driven, auteur-driven stories. Ted Hope is in charge of Amazon now, and he's basically bringing back a lot of the 90s kind of independent films, which is a great thing for independent producers as well. So I would say Amazon is a bit more prestige driven as opposed to Netflix, which is a bit more kind of works in the more commercial space. I think another kind of empty space right now, which would be great to concentrate on, are high concept, low budget films. And those are films generally under $5 million that have a wide audience appeal. So anything under $5 million with wide release potential, not just horror like Blumhouse, but even comedies, romantic rom-coms, sci-fi, things like that are needed in the marketplace right now. We talked a little about inspiring true stories. Obviously, faith-driven stories are very big right now. Man versus odds, those are definitely needed in the marketplace right now. And movies for older audiences, that's a huge market right now. There are a lot of films out there, especially distributors like Bleecker Street love these movies. There's some terrific roles for older actors out there right now, A-list older actors. So that's something to think about as well. In the horror space, contained horror is obviously huge right now. I think it's probably a bit saturated. I read so many of these specs right now, and we can talk about that a little bit more later in the question and answer period. Especially in that genre, I think it's really important to present something that's really fresh and original, and with characters we're really rooting for, because I often see a lot of contained stories that are just so similar to one another. We can talk a bit more about that in the question and answer period. But in horror right now, it seems that art house horror is big right now, and that would be auteur-driven horror like It Follows, The Babadook, The Witch, Get Out, obviously was a really timely story. Anything that's kind of going back to Sam Raimi and John Carpenter and some of those directors in the 80s and 90s. we seem to be going back to that period right now. As far as the studios go, it seems to be, you know, as the same old thing, summer tent poles, R-rated themed superhero movies like Deadpool, and internet IP like Angry Birds and Emoji Movies, and, you know, movies based on viral tweets and things like that. I think the studios are licking their wounds this summer with some of these superhero movies. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the coming year and what they plan on adding to their slate this year. Also, I think we could talk a little about virtual reality is obviously something that's huge right now. I think the technology is not quite there yet, but obviously it's in the zeitgeist right now. There's a huge untapped potential there for young adult stories, children's stories, sci-fi, things like that. There's big potential for VR right now. So I think that's certainly something to consider if you are writing a sci-fi or a young adult story, or something that's more based on say a children's book or something like that. It would help to do some research into the VR world and become more familiar with what's happening there. As far as comedies go, it's an interesting time. I think we're starting to go back to early 2000 comedies. They're making a comeback. Things like Legally Blonde, Wet Hot American Summer, Bridget Jones' Diaries. We're making zany spy movies. I think they're kind of trying everything right now in terms of comedy, especially Netflix seems to be working with some of the bigger comedy stars like Adam Sandler and people like that. We're still testing the waters there. The rom-com still seems to be non-existent. That market has kind of died. I'm not quite sure why. I'd personally like to see more rom-coms. I'd like to read more of them. I think in the independent space, they're needed. YA is still happening. I think people are still looking for a big YA franchise. It's kind of, you know, burned itself out a bit. In terms of more grounded young adult material, I think it just has to be incredibly strong and contemporary for it to really work in the marketplace right now, because that audience is really involved in tech and things like that. And they aren't typically a movie-going audience. You really have to get them into the theater and give them a good reason to go to the movie theater. So YA is struggling a little bit right now. I think everyone's looking for the next Hunger Games and another IP kind of book like that, but yet to be found. So as far as smaller movies, independent films, many of them are auteur-driven now. You see a lot of the auteur-driven films going to the festivals. Generally, independent films are a lot more bold right now. They're taking big risks. You see less dramedies, more films like Lobster, and independent films that are specifically auteur-driven, writer-directors pieces, generally in the $1 to $10 million space. I think you're starting to see less of those kind of 90s dramedies and things like that, and people taking more risks, which is great to see. I think romantic dramas right now are needed. We don't have any contemporary. I rarely read a contemporary romantic love story, and I'd love to read more of them. I'm not quite sure why that market has died, but they do very well when they do come out. And I think that's something that's certainly needed in the marketplace right now. Even sexy thrillers are kind of coming back. There's certainly a hole in the marketplace for those as well. And I think that kind of covers the current market trends. We can get more into that in the Q&A period, but I think that basically covers what's really happening right now in terms of market trends. So I think moving into standing out in a specific genre, that's something I'd like to talk a little bit more about. It's interesting. I read so many specs. For example, we can talk about why Get Out worked in the horror genre. I think horror right now is such an oversaturated market, and Blumhouse does one thing particularly well. And usually when he makes a film like Get Out, it hits the zeitgeist. It's political, it's timely. You know, the director, Jordan Peele, just wrote a beautiful character that people actually really cared about. And that's just such an important thing to think about when you're writing a horror story specifically, is to create a character that we're really rooting for with clear obstacles. Generally, I read a lot of horror scripts where I'm just never behind the protagonist. And I think it's really important to think about what's driving the story, the engine. And I think in Get Out, the timing for that film was perfect because politically it was very topical. He basically turned the concept on its head, and it just worked out very well for him. So in terms of horror, I think, you know, it's incredibly difficult to stand out in that space because you've really got to touch on something that's timely. You know, the best horror movies that work are usually horror stories that are disguised as are more metaphorical horror stories, and stories that really prey on, you know, what scares you, what scares an audience, getting to that kind of deep human, emotional roller coaster ride is what really works in terms of horror. Crime drama is something we could talk a little bit about because I do get quite a bit of those. Hell or High Water, I think, is a great example of a crime drama that worked very well in the marketplace. Again, it was a timely kind of political story, you know, about two men on their way out who were just not doing very well in their lives and losing their house to a bank. So they decided to stage a heist and steal their money. And you know, that's a wonderful concept. And I think in terms of crime dramas, stories like that really work because I often get a lot of crime dramas that are very much the same. You've got to really care about these characters, the protagonists, and even if they're doing terrible things, you know, you think about a series like The Sopranos. I mean, Tony Soprano is the perfect anti-hero. He's a terrible person, but you care about him. So, you know, the writing really has to come from a good place, from your heart, rather than your head. I think if you're writing an anti-hero like that, you really have to care about the character. So I think that's something as far as crime dramas, making, you know, that particular genre stand out. Think about films like Hell or High Water and things like that. I think right now, in terms of standing out in a specific genre, there is a big anti-tech movement, and I think there's not enough of that going on right now in the marketplace. Movies like Network and just striking that emotional chord that everyone's feeling in this country right now, which is just frustration, and being able to kind of let out that kind of frustration with movies like Network were great, and they really touched on that kind of subject matter. So I think, you know, there is a bit of an anti-tech movement right now. So we're really going back to our roots as a country. So you might want to start thinking about stories that are a little more grounded, people going back to their roots, family, things like that. I think those are important stories that need to be told right now. More human stories, I guess you could say. As I talked about before, contemporary stories with diverse casts. I get a lot of very stereotyped scripts like this. I think people like to put people in their specific boxes, and I think it's important to think about more contemporary stories with diverse casts, and not just inner city stories and things like that, or period stories about people struggling, you know, with all of that. I think it's important to get into the more contemporary problems that we're dealing with today. I think that that's certainly a world that can be worked on a bit more. As far as telling stories in a new way, I think people should be using technology a bit more in terms of thinking about how they construct a story. You know, it's funny, we used to call content film or television, and now it's just really content. So there are so many ways to tell stories now. You can tell them in 15-minute increments, 30-minute increments, anywhere up to 6-hour miniseries. So when you're looking at what you're writing, I think there's all kinds of interesting ways to create new stories in different time increments, especially. People are watching these on their iPhones and in many other ways, using different applications and things like that. So I think presenting stories to the marketplace that are created in different time increments is something to think about. So anyway, why don't we move to some questions and answer period. I'd like to talk to some of you out there and answer some of your questions.
Okay, great. We can start going through the questions. So the first one is, should new writers, given that most of them are not first ADs nor line producers, write to a budget? When I've mentioned budgets and pitches, I've occasionally heard back, let me figure out how much it costs.
Can you repeat that again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, and if you click the Q&A, you can also follow along.
Okay.
If that's also easier.
Yeah.
It says, should new writers, given that most of them are not first ADs nor line producers, write to a budget? When I've mentioned budgets and pitches, I've occasionally heard back, let me figure out how much it costs.
I think, you know, writers should have a general idea when they're writing within a specific genre of what that budget is. It's not, I don't suggest that any of them do any research as far as, you know, budgets and talking to line producers and things like that. But I think they need to stay within the constraints of the genre. So say it's a contained horror story. I think, you know, you need to think about keeping it contained, and obviously maybe it's 1 or 2 spaces, not moving states. Like for instance, right now I'm developing a dramedy. It's set in 2 different states, and we have to make the film for about $2 million. It's very difficult to make a $2 million movie in 2 states. And it's something the writers didn't think about at the time, but it's something that comes up a lot. So I would say that you should have a general idea of what the budget might be in the particular genre that you're writing. So say it's an international thriller, you know, that would be anywhere from $10 to $30 million generally. So I think it's important to keep in mind, you might want to stay away from huge set pieces. If you're writing a lower budget sci-fi movie, you might want to stay away from anything that's going to drive the budget up too much.
The next question is, can you better define the term prestige?
Yeah, sure. Prestige, if I say a prestige drama, it's more like an awards-driven film. So think of something like The King's Speech. That would be a prestige drama.
What has made recent contained horror specs stand out for you in the current slightly oversaturated market?
What horror films stand out in the current saturated market? Is that what?
Yeah, what has made recent contained horror specs stand out for you in the current slightly oversaturated market?
I think I go back to, again, protagonists that you really care about, because when it comes to horror, I think you've really got to have someone to root for. I don't care, you know, whether it's, it's you know, contained horror or something bigger than that. I think you need to start with a human protagonist that's dealing with extraordinary circumstances. That's really important. But as I said, also I think political stories, anything that's timely or topical, something with diverse cast, getting to the root of what really scares people. I mean, you know, think about what Steven Spielberg did with Jaws. You really need to find something that scares everyone and touch on that. I think that's what's important when it comes to horror.
Let's see, the next one is, I have a two-part question. When you spoke initially about diversity playing a role today, where do you see rom-coms landing, particularly in the diversity world, or is it hit and miss as to whom is attached to it? The second part of the question is, if a rom-com is written for a cast of a certain age and a budget under $5 million, how does one market it out there to be seen?
Hold on, let me just find this question here.
It's the top one.
Okay. When it comes to rom-coms, it's interesting. You know, I think there was a movie that went to Sundance this year. It sold for quite a bit of money. It was a Judd Apatow feature that he produced. You know, the cast is incredibly diverse. What made it stand out in the marketplace was it's a true story. It's a heartfelt true story. And I don't think the cast, it wouldn't have mattered whether it was diverse or not. However, you know, I think it's interesting. You tell a story like, let's go to a drama like Moonlight. And I know it's not a rom-com, but it's a good example because, you know, Moonlight's a story, a very specific story that actually appealed to a very wide audience. It wasn't necessarily, it was a love story. And I think it was marketed properly as a love story. And it didn't matter, you know, it wasn't necessarily, it didn't matter that it was about two men. I think everyone related to that particular story. So when it comes to diverse casting, it's not necessarily about the fact that, you know, you've cast a wide variety of races in this story. I think it comes down to the story. Answering the second part of the question, if a rom-com is written for a cast of a certain age and a budget under $5 million, how does one market it out there to be seen? Second part. I'm just not seeing this. Hold on one second. If the second part of the question is rom-com written for a cast of a certain age and a budget under $5 million, how does one market it, get it out there to be seen? Well, I mean, you know, the movie would be cast, financed, we make the movie. And then of course, you know, you submit it to the festivals and you bring it to Sundance or Toronto, and hopefully it sells to a distributor. And then, you know, they take it on and they market the film. So I hope that answered your question clearly.
The next question is, it feels like rom-coms are almost a no-no right now, but you mentioned that low-budget rom-coms are sought after right now. Any examples of what's hitting the marketplace in this space?
Low-budget rom-coms. I think there are plenty of them. If you go on Netflix or Amazon, you'll see quite a few low-budget rom-coms. Generally, they're made for anywhere between $1 and $5 million. The Miles Teller, I'm trying to remember the Miles Teller movie that came out recently that was a rom-com like that. But I think generally if you go to
It was
Amazon
called
or Netflix,
Two Night Stand.
exactly, but that was a few years ago. But yeah, so, you know, they're made. I'd like to personally see more of them. I think, you know, rom-coms in the studio world are so dead right now. There's a huge space for them in the indie market. So, you know, I'd love to see more of them.
There's a channel called Pixel, Pix, capital L. They specialize in low budget rom-coms.
Okay.
So there you go, guys.
There we go.
Let's see. Do those indie auteur-driven risky films like The Lobster make enough money to sustain themselves in the current streaming-dominated world of exhibitors?
You know, that's a very good question. Actually, I think most of the movies at Cannes this year had a lot of problems because they, you know, they get picked up because they're very well made. They're interesting films to watch. But as you brought up, you know, there's not usually a large audience for these particular films, and a lot of them end up on streaming services, especially in the United States. I think they're more popular in Europe. But again, in the US, and they'll be dumped on Amazon or Netflix in general. There's a small art house crowd for these films, but I think you're right. I think they're never sold. There's never a big sale for most of these movies. I think, you know, movies like Moonlight were an exception because they struck a nerve with a lot of people. So when it comes to indie kind of risky movies in general, you're right. There's generally not a wide audience for these films, which doesn't mean we should stop making them. Yeah.
Let's see. In general, what do you look for when reading a feature?
What do I look for when reading a feature? I think, you know, as I always go back to a fresh, bold voice, someone who may even break the rules, structure the script differently, create an authentic protagonist that you really care about from page one. The world should be authentic as well. You know, I look for timely political stories, anything that strikes a human chord in me. You know, I think a lot of people write for the market, and that's unfortunate. I think you should never write for the market. You should always start with yourself and what you know, and then go from there. So I suppose I respond most to human stories.
How does the action thriller market look? What are the best places to target those scripts?
What are the best places to
target for action thriller?
Got it. In terms of action thrillers, you know, I think the market's very much the same, with the difference being there are a lot of female-driven action thrillers right now. People are, you know, I think that's what's hot right now. In terms of just plain old action thrillers, there's always a market for those movies. Emmett Furler would be a good place to target. There are a number of homes that are right for action thrillers. As far as studios go, it's really, you know, Lionsgate, I suppose, still makes action thrillers. Screen Gems will make action thrillers. Some of the bigger studios generally don't do that, but in the independent space, action thrillers are still hot. So, you know, you can put together an action thriller with a decent cast and take it to a festival and package it and get it made that way.
Next question is, what called you to leave a company like Imagine and strike out on your own? What stories do you want to tell that no one else is telling?
You know, it's funny. I worked at Imagine for a long time, and most of the people who I've worked with are still there. I wanted to really tell my own stories. I think at a certain point, you kind of want to go out on your own and take a big risk and build a company and make the stories that resonate with you. So I loved Imagine. Imagine's a great company. I grew up, you know, it's funny, my father was an abstract painter, so I grew up in a very artistic family. You know, I grew up in the foreign cinema. I also saw some of the big commercial movies like the early Spielberg stuff. So I like both of those, both kinds of movies. But again, when it comes to the kind of movies I want to make, I love prestige dramas, human stories, any kind of inspiring true stories, anything like that. But also, I'd love to find a great popcorn movie. I think, there's a huge need in the independent space for profitable popcorn movies, anywhere between $5 and $10 million budgets. Blumhouse does a great job doing that in the horror space, but I feel like we could be making those movies in the rom-com space. We could be making sci-fi films in that space. So I'd like to make commercial movies in the independent world. Right now, I have 2 political thrillers I'm doing right now between $10 and $30 million. Then I'm also doing a $2 million independent dramedy Sundance kind of film. So I don't have a particular focus. I do like specialty films, and that would be, as I said, anywhere from prestige dramas to anything that can be done in the independent space for anywhere between, let's see, $1 million and $30 million.
What about stories set in rural America rather than suburbs or cities? I guess when you were talking about those are the family stories.
Yeah. No, I think rural stories are fantastic, and I think we need more stories about the heartland, especially in America, because I think Hollywood is a very isolated place. They're not so in touch with what's going on in Middle America, and I often respond to stories in the heartland of America as opposed to the big cities. I think there's a tremendous need for getting out of urban focused stories and into the real struggle of what's going on in our country. I recently read, I think it was something about a soldier who had come back from Afghanistan and was going to rebuild his house in Middle America with the help of some of the vets that he had been fighting with. And it was really beautiful. It's a beautiful story. I think we need more of those. So I'd encourage you to write in that space as well.
Let's see. As new writers, should we concentrate on low budget films?
I wouldn't say that you should concentrate on low budget films. I would say that you should concentrate on whatever excites you as a writer. There are no budget constraints. It's just really what you are looking to do, and what kind of movie do you want to see. I don't think you should limit yourself just based on your skill, because certainly you could write a big budget sci-fi movie for a studio as a first-time writer. I've seen it done many times. Or you could focus on a $2 million Sundance film. It has to come from your love of story and what you really love to write. Because if it's coming from some other place, then you're probably not doing it for the right reasons. I really don't believe you should write for the market. I believe the story has to come from you.
When it comes to web series, what subject matter seems to work? Is it perfect for a teenage audience? And who is looking for web series?
Web series, I do agree. I think it is more of a young adult teen audience. Generally, the storylines are generally, young adult, short form content, things like that. Who's looking for them? I mean, there are so many places like Awesomeness TV and people like that who are completely focused on that kind of content. I'd like to see it fall outside of that genre. I'm sure there's not only kids are staring at their iPhones watching these kind of web series. So certainly you could go into crime dramas and thrillers and find a new way to create those stories based on very short, as I was talking about before, short form content. So say you're creating a crime thriller, you might want to unfold it in 15-minute increments, or a thriller can be made that way. I think there's, you know, that material is ripe for mining in that particular space.
Have you heard if Netflix is interested in producing mid-budget films for theatrical release prior to streaming?
Yes, they are doing that, and I think they are doing that really specifically to appeal to theater owners, because there's such a clash there, but also in competing with Amazon, because Amazon is much more focused on releasing their the films that they create internally theatrically. So that's kind of luring a lot of the prestige auteur, bigger directors towards Amazon, because they are guaranteeing a bigger theatrical release versus Netflix, who tends to just stream.
Can you give some examples of sci-fi budget features?
Sci-fi
budget features?
I'm
guessing like low budget features?
Oh, yeah, maybe, or mid-budget. Yeah,
yeah,
sure.
Something, I guess, not with like tons of special effects and $50 million.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you know, people always go to Ex Machina. It's obviously not a low-budget feature. It's more of a mid-budget feature. I think it's probably made for 15 million or something like that. But I think Ex Machina is a good example of something that can be done on a mid-level budget, relatively contained, and, you know, still feel like a studio movie. So I think there are a lot of production companies who are looking for sci-fi stories like Ex Machina and things like that, that are kind of more in the 10 to 20 million space, something that can be made for, say, $15 million and get a wide release. There are smaller ones as well. Upstream Color would be an independent sci-fi movie. So I think that was made for under $1 million.
When you say there's an opportunity right now in a genre, do you have in mind a time window? I just worry about trying to find a place in a genre only to have the industry already have moved to fill that niche.
When you say there's an opportunity right now in genre, do you have a time window? I assume by genre you mean horror?
I think they mean any genre, but when you say there's an opportunity like for rom-com or horror or anything, I think what they're saying is that they're worried that they're going to write to that genre, and by the time their script is done, that genre will be oversaturated and they won't. The script will be superfluous.
I don't, you know, to be honest, it's funny. People say things are out, things are in. You know, we talked about things today that are, you know, hot in the marketplace right now, but I think you always have to think ahead as a writer and look at what's not in the marketplace. So I would say, you know, to worry about what genre you're writing in right now and whether that's going to be out or in is something that I wouldn't concentrate on. I would concentrate on writing a fresh, original story with authentic characters in any genre, and hope that it resonates. I just don't think you should be following the trends so much. I think maybe you should look at what's not trending, or look ahead and write for that market. So say, you know, as I said before, there are very few romantic dramas out there right now, contemporary romantic dramas. I think that's a huge hole that needs to be filled right now. You know, you should always be looking ahead and seeing what's not resonating right now, and perhaps that might work for you. But again, I think, you know, an original, inspiring, authentic story will always work in the marketplace, no matter what genre it is.
This question kind of relates to that. In 2010, there was Night and Day, The Bounty Hunter, and Killers, all with very similar premises. And in 2011, there was No Strings Attached and Friends with Benefits, both with the same premise. Why do studios release films that are close to or the same premise as other studios?
That's a good question. I think what it is really, you know, when you make, so you can make a particular film that someone else seems to be making at the same time. And generally, there's not a lot of communication in this town. People aren't aware of similar films that are being made at the same time. So you can certainly be making, you know, I could be making a rom-com that's very much like my other, another production company's rom-com. Unfortunately, some of them happen to be released around the same time. So you get two very similar stories in the same genre that are released at the same time. And it happens, just, it's a superfluous thing, but it does tend to happen in this, you know, in Hollywood quite often.
So see, guys, even if you write the same thing, it doesn't mean it won't get made. Okay, can you give one more definition of auteur?
One more definition. You know, I think it's really a filmmaker with a vision. So, you know, just a director with a daring vision. Generally, when you say auteur driven, it's usually writer director driven.
What are creative ways for an unrepped writer to get a contemporary, female-driven, diverse, low-budget, character-driven drama spec script into the market?
Well, there are various places you could go with your script. Certainly, you could go to Roadmap and expose it that way. There are certainly a number of competitions that you could submit your script to. There are websites you can post your script on. I think queries they're, you know, I get a lot of query letters, and it's very difficult to send out a query letter that I think is really going to respond to a producer or an agent's going to respond to. I don't recommend it. I think, you know, your best route is really to go to any of these services and expose your script that way.
Let's see, what keeps you reading a script after the first few pages, and what makes you give up on a script after a few pages?
Yeah, that's a good question. I still think it always comes down to an authentic protagonist who's under a tremendous obstacle. So I think you've got to really start with someone that immediately you can get behind and keep the pages turning. The story has to have an engine. I think Aaron Sorkin always talks about this when he does his seminars, and he's right. It's just always about obstacles and intention, always. So if there's no intention or obstacle, I think, you know, the story very quickly loses steam.
Which also is for you guys who go, but it gets really good on page 20 or 22. The execs aren't going to give you until 20 or 22. It has to get really good in the first few pages. So yeah, don't sit and save the good stuff, because I'm seeing some questions about that. Like, yeah, it's a slow burn.
That happens a lot. I you know, often a script won't start off strong, and you'll put it down, or this happens often, quite often. The twist will come, you know, so far down the line in the story, say page 90 or something, that and it often happens where I read a twist and I'm just amazed by the twist, but it comes so late in the story that everything leading up to that doesn't really keep you going.
Let's see, what is the most effective way for executives to want to read your script?
I think a good log line always helps. You know, it's funny, I get all kinds of creative ways to present a log line, but I think if you really focus on one line that's really going to resonate, that's going to get someone's attention. So I think when you're thinking about a log line, some people don't even put log lines down. generally, I don't think anyone's going to read your entire synopsis. So I think it really helps to have a really effective logline.
Oh, sorry, I was like still muted. It seems like I didn't realize that. It seems like market trends are always changing. Do you have any methods you'd suggest for a writer to use to gauge market trends a year from now or even 5 years from now?
I think it's the same thing. You have to just read all of the periodicals, read everything online. It's like predicting what a stock is going to do, or which way the economy is going to go, or it's tough. I think you always have to look ahead. I talked about anti-tech stories earlier, and I think you can look at something like that where we're being consistently saturated by all kinds of new apps and things like that. People aren't living in the moment anymore. I think you really need to look ahead that way and think about, well, if we're being saturated by all of this stuff, what's a story that goes against that? What's going to bring people back down to earth and connecting and family and those stories I think are really important right now. Human stories about connecting and getting back to what's really important in the world.
In terms of topical scripts dealing with current political issues, are you seeing good scripts on feminist issues? Not only strong female characters, but dealing with women's issues like Hidden Figures, not necessarily combined with race like that movie. Could you describe what you like to see in this space?
Yeah, it's funny. I get a lot of female-driven action thrillers. They're very hot right now. I actually just optioned a story about it with a strong female protagonist. It's more of a drama. I would like to see more contemporary stories about with female protagonists dealing with, I suppose, their day-to-day, the day-to-day issues that affect them. I think to jump on the kind of feminist train is not necessarily the best way to go when you're creating a female-driven story right now, because we're getting kind of saturated with that. It might be smarter to go the other way and maybe write a great love story, or something that deals with family, or something that deals with say a contemporary job. Anything in the female profession would be good. You go back to movies, some of the earlier Anne Hathaway movies were even decent. But I think, you can't jump on the train, the female action train, as I said. I think to deal with just the day-to-day kind of female protagonists is the most effective way to go. And that goes for dramas, as well.
You talked about crime and dramas. How do you see true stories of redemption in this genre landing in the marketplace? And can you expand upon what kind of stories there might be not enough of in this genre?
Crime dramas, do you see true stories of redemption in this genre landing in the marketplace? Crime dramas. Yes, of course. As far as crime dramas go, I often get a lot of kind of small town crime dramas that are very familiar. It's funny. Everyone's trying to kind of replicate Hell or High Water, or a lot of them fall into this kind of Mexican drug cartel world. I think you really have to be inventive when it comes to crime dramas, and again, create protagonists that we actually care about, even if they're anti-heroes. I think it's important, no matter what kind of terrible things they're doing, that they're human. They're human, three-dimensional protagonists, and that's what really makes a crime drama stand out for me. a human story that resonates on that level, as well as the typical crime drama that we see every day. Yeah, I think that's probably about right. And I could come up with some examples. I know I talked about The Sopranos. You can talk about some of the, what was the other Bryan Cranston series that I'm not thinking of right now.
Breaking Bad?
Yeah, Breaking Bad. Another good example of an anti-hero, someone that you care about who's doing awful things. But there's a particular thing about that story is this is a man who's trying to kind of save the situation that he's in, because he's anyway. There's always an emotional through line to the crime dramas that really resonate with me, and I think with most audiences.
Is there anyone out there making films that are female-driven sci-fi adventure that could be made between 10 and 30 million?
Yeah, a female-driven film that could be made between 10 and making such films. Sure. I mean, I would say that Ex Machina is another example of something like that. Female protagonist. It was probably made for $15 million. I think Scarlett Johansson's recent film was also somewhere in there, but I guess that was more of a thriller. But there are plenty of sci-fi movies with female protagonists, and I think more are needed, definitely.
If you want to target an actor, is it best to go through their agent? So many times they're just a gatekeeper waiting for packaged films.
Do you want to target an actor's best go through an agent? Well, that's a tough one. I think, as an unknown writer, going to an agent with the script for a particular actor is a very tough way to go. I would recommend presenting it to a producer first, bringing on a producer, and then taking it to an actor. I think it's really hard to find an open door that way. So I'd recommend, submitting it to production companies or getting an agent before presenting it to an actor.
Do you think the reason rom-coms are doing poorly in the studios is that audiences have changed in the past 20 years and studios haven't?
No, I don't. I think the audience is still there. I think the whole rom-com problem is the market was really saturated. I don't know, 10 years ago, there were just so many of them coming out that we started to veer away from them because there were a few misfires, and the studios started, really concentrating on the big tentpoles. So they just shifted away from these mid-budget films, and the rom-com went out the door with all the rest of them. But I think there is, R-rated rom-coms are still big. Generally, they're female-driven. I think the audience is still there. I think there's plenty of people who would love to see a rom-com, but they've got to be smart, contemporary, and not necessarily female-driven.
Before we continue with questions, Christian, did you have more stuff to say that you wanted to let the writers know, or do you want to just keep going through questions?
Yeah, no, I think, again, I just wanted to touch on a little bit more about, I covered some of the current trends in the marketplace and all that. But again, when it comes to your specific screenplay standing out in a genre, I really think it's important to, as I said, don't write for the marketplace. Really, you've got to find a story that really resonates with you. And when it does, the reader always knows that. Whenever I read a story that comes from the right place, I always gravitate towards those stories. So I don't think you should necessarily be following trends. I think you should be aware of trends. I think you should watch Netflix, Amazon, network television, and go to the movies and see what's out there. But you've got to really find a story that resonates with you. and be able to live with it for a number of years, because it takes a good 2-3 years to develop these stories. So even when I'm looking for a project, if I don't fall in love with it, I generally don't take it on, because I've got to live with that for a good 2 to 3 years. So you've really got to be in love with something in order to take it on. So again, don't follow the trends. If you're writing a true story, do your research. I find, all kinds of true stories that, let's talk about true stories for a minute, actually. I think it's a good idea. True stories are, people always ask these questions because I get quite a few of them. I think it always helps to, if you're going to write a true story, it really helps to have a piece of IP that you're basing that on. It's very tough when you're writing an original true story to get that kind of project set up. Generally, people like things that come from some kind of IP, whether, and I'm not saying it has to be a best-selling book. It could be an article that you find in a local newspaper. Generally, there are a lot of journalists around the country who write fascinating stories that you can find online. It's really easy to track these people down. I've done it many times. So you don't always have to go for the big stories, but I think it's tough, especially when it comes to true stories, to sell anything that's not particularly based on IP. And we can get into IP a little bit more if you want me to talk about IP. Do you want to get into IP right now?
I mean, whatever you like. Do you have a hard out at 5:30?
No, I could talk about IP for a minute, because I think it's important. Even as an independent producer, I've developed two movies based on novels, and it's funny, people always think, oh, I can never option a book on my own. I'm an unknown writer who's going to listen to me. Well, I don't think that's true. My first movie, I tracked down the author myself. I optioned the book, and I developed it with her, and we made a great film. So, you need to be proactive. Read novellas, read short stories, plays. There's so much material out there that could be mined right now. There are websites you can go to, certainly self-published authors on Amazon who have big followings that you can approach. I always think, stories that are best based on IP are going to resonate more in the marketplace. They're just easier to set up. They're easier to get some attention on, and unless you're completely focused on original screenplays, I don't think there's any reason to stay away from IP. So, as I said, true stories.
Were you also saying before about Stephen King, the dollar stories?
About Stephen King?
Yeah, that he had an archive where you can option for $1.
Yeah, Stephen King has, I believe he options his stories for $1 or something like that. Short stories, he has an entire kind of catalog of short stories. So, these people are approachable. You can find them on, Facebook. You can go to their Twitter. Authors have their own websites. I do that all the time. So, really do the homework. Go out there, read not just the New York Times or the LA Times or the Washington Post, but there are plenty of other newspapers out there with really intriguing true stories. And those journalists are generally easy to track down. So I think it's really important for writers to be proactive when it comes to IP, because we're not just talking about, best-selling novels. We're talking about, endless amounts of novellas and short stories that can be adapted. And, Arrival's a really good example of that. That was a short story. There are millions of examples of great short stories that can be optioned and made into big studio films.
Okay, did you want to cover anything else or go back to questions?
We can go back to questions.
Okay, next question is, can you explain what authenticity means when it comes to characters?
Hmm. Yeah, sure. So, say I'm writing a Southern drama. I think, you really need to immerse yourself in that world and not go towards the stereotypes. So authentic would be, you might want to find someone who lives in that particular borough, develop some kind of relationship with them. I'm just talking about real authentic people as opposed to stereotypes.
Do you think for a new writer, pitching a small Sundance kind of feature is a harder sell if the writer also plans to direct the film?
Do you think for a new writer, pitching small? It is. It is harder. I run into it all the time. And it's not necessarily because you're a new director. I think what it comes down to is if you are a new director, if you do want to direct your own first script, you need to have a short film or some kind of work behind it that you can show to people, because it's just not enough to go to a producer and say, well, I'd like to direct this. I think, they need to actually see something that you've done in order to take something like that on, because it's very difficult. And I've dealt with it many times, to take on a project with a new writer director who has nothing to show. It's very difficult to get something like that financed, even with a star attached. It's typically very hard. So I would recommend taking the time to make a short movie, a short film, and putting some real effort into that before presenting it to the market.
Another question that's related to that is, are proof of concepts or sizzle reels the way to go now? They are so expensive to make. Are they really worth it?
Yeah, I think they are. I mean, again, if you don't have anything to show, I think it's really hard. The script would just have to be incredibly authentic and exciting. And, I suppose if you wanted to present something with all the storyboards done and all that, perhaps you could create a video on YouTube that might kind of project your vision for the film. But I think, short films can certainly be done, especially these days, for very little money. And there are certainly, crews that will work on these films for free if you have a good vision and the story's great. So I would encourage you to, to create your own content if you're an up and coming writer director and want to, direct your first feature.
If they don't want to direct and they're only a writer, do you think proof of concepts and sizzle reels are still worth it? If they're only a writer?
Oh, I must have misunderstood. Sorry. No, if you're only a writer, I don't think they're important at all. I think a good story is important. I don't think you need anything else to sell your story, unless it's really high concept. But I don't think it's necessary.
You didn't misunderstand. I just wanted the writers to understand that that you were talking about director writers, and for writers, it's a different answer.
Yeah.
Next question is, you mentioned faith-based films are trending. Are there specific studios making them?
Yeah, sure. There are. Lionsgate makes quite a few of them. Participant makes quite a few of them. New Line doesn't really do it anymore. Most of the studios will jump at a faith-based picture, just depending on really what the story is. So they're pretty hot right now. Anyway.
Let's see. As an executive, do you recommend new writers to focus on a certain drama, or do you encourage writers to expand into different dramas?
Do you recommend new writers to focus on a certain drama?
I wonder if they meant genre.
Oh, as an executive, do you recommend new writers to focus on certain drama? Hmm.
Yeah, they have a correction down there, and they said they meant genre, not drama. So yeah, as an executive, do you recommend new writers to focus on a certain genre, or do you encourage writers to expand into different genres?
Hmm. No, I think I think that's a great question, actually. I think people should expand into different genres. You know, if you're comfortable in horror, there's no reason why, you know, you couldn't move into a true story or sci-fi or comedy. I think that's the great test of a writer, is to move between genres and not just be focused on one. So, you know, often all good movies, you know, there are a lot of horror movies that are disguised, there are political thrillers that are disguised as horror films. People blend genres all the time. So, you know, I think it's a good exercise for a writer to move between comedies, sci-fi, horror. You should definitely be able to move between genres.
Do you find there are distinguishable differences between scripts that rise to the top through the blacklist versus scripts that rise to the top through Nichols versus scripts that rise to the top through Austin in terms of being commercial, artistic, unique, character-driven, etc.? Please explain and comment on any other major script competitions you read the finalists of as well, if possible.
Yeah, there are differences, I think. You know, when you talk about something like The Blacklist versus Nicole, you know, Austin, places like that, you know, I notice a lot of the scripts that move to the top of the blacklist are biopics, or they're, you know, stories with diverse casts, true stories, topical, political stories, things like that. Those prestige dramas, those tend to be the focus of the blacklist, and, you know, movies that get set up through that list every year. The Nicole list, you know, it really varies. It's I read all kinds of stories on every year on the Nicole list, and you know, generally some of their stuff is multicultural, but some of it's also very commercial. It's pretty widespread on the Nicole list. They don't seem to have a particular focus. In terms of other contests, I don't really read many of them. Austin, I don't think I've ever read. I generally seem to focus on Nicole and the Blacklist and several other competitions. But, you know, I'm trying to think of others. Yeah, those are pretty much my focus.
In your opinion, do streaming platforms such as Amazon and Netflix give a writer or director less of a reputation in the long run versus a theatrical release?
It's a good question. Less of a reputation. You know, everyone wants a theatrical release, including me. Sure, of course. You know, I think they're still feeling that out right now. Netflix has released a few big budget films recently that have gotten a bit lost. And I think they're starting to figure out that the marketing end of that is a bit difficult. We're not really sure how many people are seeing these films. Amazon seems to be more focused on theatrically releasing their original films before they stream them. I don't think, you know, it's damaging to release your movie on a streaming service, or it's going to hurt your career, but certainly everyone would like a wide theatrical release, sure.
Then this is no one's asking, I'm just asking as a follow-up.
Yeah.
If you have a wide theatrical release and it like bombs, is that worse than, and is that still like, hey, I got a theatrical release? Or is it like, well, you got it, but it bombed? Is that like worse than, hey, I did 3 films on Amazon or Netflix?
No one likes a bomb for sure. But, you know, there are so many reasons why movies bomb these days that you just can't anticipate them. And I don't think, unless it's really poorly reviewed, I don't think it's damaging unless of course it is poorly reviewed, and then that hurts. But you know, as far as streaming versus theatrical goes, I think people are starting to come around and realize that, you know, if you want a wide audience, your movie is going to be streamed regardless. But, you know, theatrical is still preferred to some degree.
Hollywood likes tradition. Guys, if you have any last questions, get them in now because we're heading towards the end of the questions. Somebody asked, how about public domain IP? I think when you were talking about...
Oh, yeah. Public domain IP. Of course, I mean, you know, it's rich for mining and people do it all the time. There are so many period stories and novels online that are public domain. Those stories are made over and over again. So yeah, I would definitely spend a lot of time mining public domain IP. You know, it's funny when I talk about IP, it's funny people think that's going to hurt their pocketbook or going to be, you know, a real hurdle to find some IP that's really going to resonate with people. But it's not necessarily expensive. You know, if you can make a real connection to the writer or the novelist and establish some kind of trust, you know, generally you can option anything for, you know, starting at a dollar for, generally I option things for 12 months with a 6-month extension. So, you know, you have something for 18 months. That would be the recommended period. You know, you can get something for free versus when the movie is made, they'll be paid. So I would encourage you to track down IP and you know, become proactive. But I would also recommend that you use an entertainment lawyer because that kind of negotiating can get tricky and you don't want to get into trouble when it comes to optioning IP.
We actually did a webinar all about optioning. So if anyone's interested, hit up me or Dorian and we can talk about that.
Yeah.
And like rights, you guys, if like Christian's saying with the extension, they're so tricky and complicated. If you don't renew, they go up for grabs. And I don't know if you guys have heard, I know it's a shitty series, but it made a ton of money. A little thing called Twilight. MTV had the rights to that. They forgot to renew it and Summit swooped in and picked it up. And that's how Summit became one of the biggest production companies today.
Yeah.
Before Lionsgate purchased them. But before that, they were just a tiny little no-name and MTV dropped the ball. So I'm sure someone got fired.
Yeah, be really careful about that, guys. Don't draw up your own contracts.
Yeah, and if you do option something, stay on top of it. Those deadline dates that are on those contracts, they are ironclad. Like once that date comes and you didn't renew, that's it. You don't have the option anymore. So if you wrote the script and you don't have the option, you're going to be kind of screwed. So just pay attention. Let's see. Next question is, do you have any thoughts on short films as opposed to feature?
Would that be writing short film versus a feature?
Yeah, let's go with that.
Okay. You know, I generally tend to say if you're going to write something, why not write a feature? You know, a short film, I suppose, you know, if you wanted to write and direct it, that would be a good way to go. But I would say, you know, if you're going to write something, write a feature. But again, I talked about new ways to write a story, especially with content going the way it's going right now. You know, people are finding all kinds of ways to tell stories. So you can write something that's in the 15-minute space and tell a story that way. You know, so in terms of short films versus feature films, I think the idea of content is changing now. So, you know, you can write in all kinds of time frames is what I'm trying to say.
How do you work with your writers in shaping their projects? i.e., are you very hands-on?
Yeah, generally I am. You know, it depends on the script, of course. some scripts, you know, sometimes you get a script that's in really good shape and it needs just a polish. Generally, in that case, I would bring on a director, and the director would do a polish with the writer. And then, you know, when they're finished, I read it and give a few notes, and maybe we do another polish. But if it's a great concept and maybe not particularly well executed, perhaps I'd take something like that on, and then I'd spend a lot of time developing that, doing multiple passes with the writer, giving pretty extensive notes. So in general, yeah, I'm pretty hands-on. Yep.
Let's see. You mentioned Peak TV earlier. Can you chat about where we are at the moment with content versus amount of platforms and outlets?
Yeah, I think we have an excess amount of content right now. You know, it's a fight right now as far as distribution and outlets, because, you know, there are really going to be only 2 or 3 survivors in this fight. So, you know, I think we're getting to a point with, as I said before, with Peak TV, where there's just so much content because you've got 2 or 3 outlets who are fighting to build their slate right now and fighting for viewership. So eventually that's going to burn itself out, and you know, there will be less TV series because there's just not a wide enough audience for this kind of thing right now. But the reason why there is a surplus right now is because there are quite a few, you know, there are quite a few streaming services out there who are fighting this battle for the largest audience, and eventually, you know, those will fall away and we'll be left with 2 or 3. So I see, you know, Peak TV kind of starting to pull back a bit right now.
I've heard before that every one profitable movie a production company studio makes is making up for 9 others they made that were not financially successful. Is this true?
Yes, that is true. Generally, studios, what they do is something called slate financing. So what they'll do is they spread out the investment between 8 or 10 movies. So one in maybe every genre. So say Get Out does very well, then you know, maybe some prestige film they released that year lost a lot of money. That particular genre movie will make up for it. So that's the idea. Whole idea behind slate financing is it's like a stock. You know, one stock will do well, and the ones that don't do well, you know, will fall away, but the one that does will make up for all the rest.
Last question, unless other people want to say anything, is do you, okay, there we go, see. Anytime I say that, magically more questions appear. Do you rep a script or the writer? Do you prefer a writer have multiple projects, or is one enough for now if it's solid?
No, I'm not a manager. So a manager would be, or an agent would be repping a writer. As a producer, I would only option a script. So there's a difference. Generally, you know, I option a script, and that person is either represented or not, or looking for representation. Do I prefer a writer who has multiple projects, or one? Is one enough for now? Well, I think that would be a better question for a manager or an agent, because as you know, as a producer, you know, it really doesn't matter to me whether a writer has one or more projects. Generally, if I'm looking at a writer and I'm interested in their work, I'll read, you know, all of their specs, and maybe I'll develop something with them if I like their writing. And I choose not to option one of their scripts. Maybe we'll come up with an idea and then develop it together.
And chances are, if Christian options, that would probably also open the door to getting repped. That they have something that a producer is producing.
Yeah, and generally, if I you know, option something from a writer who's unknown, I'll recommend them to a manager.
Yeah, but that's like the major difference between also producers and managers and agents is managers and agents want people that have multiples, but producers are looking at the script more than they're looking at the writer.
Right.
But like,
right.
yeah, but that yeah, there's benefits to both sides, but they work hand in hand eventually. Let's see. The last question is, when being pitched, do you prefer the full script be completed, or can someone pitch the concept and log line and the major twist and character arc?
Oh, can I see that?
Sorry, it disappeared, but they were saying, like, does the script have to be completed, or can they just pitch you the concept, log line, and the plot points, basically?
Yeah, no, I prefer that the script's completed, because pitching just an idea, or, you know, unless it's something that's extremely high concept, it should be really completed by the time you pitch it to me. Unless it's, yeah, something that's very high concept, or maybe an interesting true story that hasn't been fully fleshed out yet, that maybe you have the life rights to, or something like that.
So if it's existing IP, then it would be different.
Yeah.
But even then, you would prefer?
I prefer a screenplay, yeah, unless it's IP.
Yeah, and guys, I will tell you right now, 99.9% of the people you pitch are going to prefer a completed script, because you can pitch them the most amazing project in the world, but if you can't write, it's not going to make a difference.
No.
Okay, another question is, having worked at Imagine, did that make you lean more towards feature-oriented projects as a producer, or TV as well?
Well, you know, at Imagine, we also made TV over there, and they still continue to do that. But I was in the feature world there, so yeah, I lean more towards features. I'm starting to get involved in television now, but I've been really focused on features for most of my career.
Okay, I think that's all the questions. Christian, is there anything else that you want to let the writers know?
Again, I think, you know, it's really important to, in terms of making your script stand out in a crowded genre or in the marketplace, you know, just, it's really important to keep timely subject matter in mind, anything that's current. Again, fresh characters, stories that are human and come from the heart, that really move the reader. You know, and anything that's just boldly original, and turning something like Get Out, where, you know, you completely turn a concept on its head. Those seem to stand out the most for me when I'm reading specs. So I appreciate your time today.
And we appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise with us. This was very, very useful, and I see lots of compliments in the chat. So thank you again, and everyone, you'll get the recording later. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Have a good day,
I appreciate
Christian.
it. Thank
Bye.
you. Have a good day. Thank you.